Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gunnar Dick, and I work in the Center for Digital Life Norway. And I welcome you all to today's Volterra lecture given by Professor Nikolas Rose. So the Center for Digital Life is an unprecedented initiative by the Research Council of Norway and the 3 major universities in Norway. And the aim is to transform Norwegian biotechnology. Today, we will focus on neuroscience and developments in the field and how this might change our understanding of ourselves and our societies. So, the Volterra lectures are named in honor of Vito Volterra, one of the first mathematical biologists, and the lectures are to be given by internationally recognized authorities, esteemed for their contribution within life science research or technology development. And today's lecture is organized in collaboration with the DLM project GigiBrain, headed by Associated Professor Marianne Fien. And the project is hosted by the Department of Biosciences. And we also co-host this with the Science Library. And of course, both the Science Library and department is part of the Faculty of Mathematics and Natural Sciences here at the University of Oslo. So I should say that we are streaming this lecture, and it will also be published on the YouTube channel of the Science Library and the Center afterwards. After the lecture, we will have a panel debate moderated by Marianne, and at that point she will introduce the panel. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Nikolas Rose. He's a professor of sociology at King's College in London. Originally trained as a biologist, and then he switched to psychology and then to sociology. His work explores how scientific developments have changed conceptions of human identity and governance, and what this means for our political, socioeconomic, and legal futures. In his academic career, he was 10 years at Goldsmiths College, where he was head of sociology and Prue Warden for research. He then joined the London School of Economics in 2002, where he was Martin White Professor of Sociology and head of the Department of Sociology from 2002 to 2006. He founded BIOS, Center for the Study of Bioscience, Biomedicine, Biotechnology and Society at London School of Economics, and was its director since its inception in 2003. Then he joined King's in January 2012 and established the new Department of Social Science, Health and Medicine. And today he will present his lecture, Neuroscience and the Politics of Mental Health. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks for making the arrangement for me to come here, and thanks to the Centre Digital Life, DigiBrain, and those other organisations for making it possible for me to come and speak to you today. So, the future of psychiatry, it's a big topic, and it's actually the title, or almost the title of my forthcoming book with Polity Press on this subject. And I'm going to kind of outline some of the arguments that I make in that book, many of which have to do with how we should understand the current fascination with the question of the brain. It sometimes seems, or certainly seemed when I started doing my work in this area, as if every aspect of human conduct that had previously been explained in psychological terms could now be given the prefix neuro and explained in terms of neurobiology. More pressingly, many countries across the world have started big brain projects. The Human Brain Project, of which I'm a member of the Ethical and Social Division, but I should stress I speak here in my personal capacity, was the first, followed by the US Brain Initiative, and then similar initiatives in Canada, in Japan, in Cuba, in India, and in China. Now, although these brain initiatives differ, they share a double kind of objective, which was articulated quite clearly by James Collins when he was announcing by Francis Collins when he was announcing the US Brain Initiative. And part of it was that the brain was the final frontier, and to understand more about the way in which the hundreds of billions of neurons in the brain and their trillions of connections interact in real time, to understand how humans think, feel, and understand and remember. But second, there was another ambition in this new moonshot, and that was, to quote Collins again, to transform efforts to help the more than 1 billion people worldwide who suffer from autism, depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other devastating brain disorders, close quotes. Now, responses from the social and human sciences to this increasing popular and scientific focus on the brain have ranged from enthusiastic adoption of brain-based understandings to critiques of neuromania. And in my book, Neuro, which was published a few years ago, I argued for a slightly different relationship, which I called critical friendship. And this talk is offered in that spirit. It's also more generally part of what I call, following Michel Foucault and Ian Hacking, historical ontology. That is to say, an investigation into the events that have led us to constitute ourselves and to recognize ourselves as subjects of what we're doing, thinking, and saying. Are we witnessing a change in the kinds of creatures that we take ourselves to be? And if so, with what consequences? Now, I've argued elsewhere that there are quite radical possibilities in contemporary neurosciences, especially in the recognition that so much of our forms of life are managed outside our conscious awareness. But I'm not going to focus on those today. What I'm going to do after a few words of introduction is to emphasize the critical science, the critical side of this critical friendship, and draw attention to what I think are some quite fundamental flaws in the way in which brain science has been taken up within psychiatry. And as I close, I'm going to try and point to another way in which we can think about the role of neuroscience in psychiatry, which is no less respectful of neuroscience, no less engaged with questions of the brain, but relates brain neuroscience and mental distress in a rather different way. So some might hear this as a talk against neuroscience, but it's not. It's a talk for neuroscience to become what I would call a genuinely human science. But first, a few words of historical ontology. Charles Sherrington, a great neuroscientist, said at the turn of at the beginning of the 20th century, we have to regard the relationship of mind to brain as not merely unsolved, but devoid of a basis for its very beginning. And 50 years later, introducing a series on the BBC Third programme, he said something similar. Aristotle, 2,000 years ago, was asking how the mind is attached to the body. We're asking that question still. He didn't think much progress had been made in addressing that fundamental question in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Now, in Neuro, working with Joël Abi-Rached, we argued that one could trace the birth of neuroscience to the neuroscience research program started by Francis Schmidt at MIT in 1962, where he sought to bring together the wet, the moist, and the dry sciences of the brain into one single project of neuroscience. I'm not going to dwell on that today, but just point to the fact that by the end of the 20th century, another great neuroscientist, Vernon Mountcastle, took a very different view of that than that articulated by Sherrington. The half-century's accumulation, that's the 50 years since Sherrington made that comment that I just quoted, the half-century's accumulation of knowledge of brain function has brought us face to face with the question of what it means to be human. We make no pretension that solutions are at hand, but assert that what makes man human is his brain. Things mental, indeed minds, are emergent properties of brains. Now, I think this radical proposition was probably shared by almost everybody working in the field that was now called neuroscience. The brain, after all, was an organ like any other organ. It was made up of cells, and those cells had biophysical properties. They had synapses, they had receptor sites, they had ion channels. All of these could be explained in terms of their physical, chemical, and electrical properties that made them up. And clearly, if that is what constituted the brain, then variations in the brain, variations in normal brain function, had to be understood in terms of, at least in principle, intelligible variations and processes at this neuromolecular level. And if normal variations in brain function could be understood in that way, so surely, at least in principle, could mental disorders and mental pathologies. This neuromolecular level was the level at which we were to understand what makes humans human. Mind is an emergent property of these molecular processes within the human brain. Now, in my earlier work, I charted what I called a psi complex, the emergence of a complex of ways of thinking and ways of acting based on the idea that human beings were inhabited by a deep interior psychological space, which was known by the psi disciplines, which was the locus of one's biography, the origins of one's thoughts and beliefs, and the place where mental pathologies had to be understood and located. It was a primary target of investigation by the new experts of the psi domain, the psi experts as experts of subjectivity. And when I started my work on neuro back in 2007, my question was really, and my hypothesis was really quite a simple one. Had psi been replaced by neuro? But I think, to cut a very long story short, that was far too simple a way of thinking about it. Sure, there were many people who argue that our policy should be based not on psychological conceptions of human beings, but on neurobiological conceptions of human beings. But we haven't seen fundamental changes in social policy. Even the much vaunted nudge policies don't really base themselves very much on neuroscience. Some people said there was going to be a radical transformation in the law because it wouldn't be I made that decision, it would be my brain made that decision. My brain made me do it. And there were lots of discussions about the implications of the end of free will in the law, where we actually have not seen that, and that's another long story. Neuroeconomics taught us that human beings were not rational in making their decisions. Well, few of us actually thought that, and so on, and so on, and so on. One area where there have been major transformations is in military neuroscience and security neuroscience, and my group's done some work on that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to focus on the question of mental disorder. Because if there is one place where there has been a real transformation in the way in which we address these questions, it is in the area of mental disorder. In 1999, David Satcher, the US Surgeon General, remarked in his excellent report on mental disorder. Mental disorders are characterized by abnormalities in cognition, emotional mood, or the highest integrative aspects of behavior, blah, blah, blah. These mental functions are all mediated by the brain. It is, in fact, a core tenet of modern science that behavior and our subjective mental lives reflect the overall workings of the brain. Symptoms related to behavior of mental lives clearly reflect variations or abnormalities in brain function. Well, let's not pause. We shouldn't really ask the Surgeon General of the United States to solve the mind-body problem, but we might want to reflect on what's meant by reflect here. Here's Tom Insel writing in his blog in 2013. Tom Insel, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. Mental disorders are biological disorders involving brain circuits that implicate specific domains of cognition, emotion, or behavior. Well, again, my friends might want to focus on what was meant by that little word, are. And here's InCell's successor, Josh Gordon, writing when he took over in 2016 with no hesitation whatsoever. Psychiatric disorders are disorders of the brain, and to make progress in treating them, we really have to understand the brain. If we can get to these questions of how neural circuits produce behavior, this may soon generate new treatments for psychiatric disorders, etc., etc., etc. So this is the question I want to focus on in the next half hour. Are mental disorders brain disorders? And if they are, what implications? And if they're not, then how might we re-understand the relationship between mental distress and the brain? Certainly, there are some who have absolutely no doubts about it. This is Uli Witchen and his group estimating, as they have done very regularly, the size and burden of mental disorders and, quotes, other disorders of the brain in Europe 2010. And following their estimate of the burden of brain disorders, which is a phrase I particularly dislike because of its historical residues, but I'm not going to dwell on this particular image in this particular German magazine in the 1930s, as well as estimating the burden of brain disorders. They say this: depression, schizophrenia, panic disorder, drug dependence, and insomnia are examples of mental disorders, while dementia, epilepsy, and multiple sclerosis exemplify neurological disorders. Both laypersons and professionals are typically unaware of the commonalities and shared mechanism of brain disorders. So from insomnia and depression to dementia and epilepsy and multiple sclerosis, we see the domain of brain disorders. A little while around the same time, three professors, a neuroscientist, a neurologist, and a psychiatrist, published a paper which went under this title: Time to End the Distinction Between Mental and Neurological Diseases. And they argued that modern science had shown that that distinction between mental and neurological illnesses was an unhelpful one, and one which was no longer scientifically tenable. And they argued that there were three domains of evidence which demonstrated this clearly. First of all, neuroimaging, which had shown structural brain abnormalities in schizophrenia, bipolar affective disorder, depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and similar differences of brain imaging shown by functional brain imaging in the representation of the emotions, in the limbic system, etc., etc., in depression and bipolar disorder. So neuroimaging had shown without doubt that these disorders were disorders of the brain. Genomic research has begun to delineate the genetic architecture of these disorders, and psychiatric drugs work by altering brain function and structure, so the efficacy of antidepressants is correlated with brain activation in those parts of the brain that mediate mood. Now, theirs is not the only, and perhaps it's not the best articulation of this view that there should no longer be a distinction between mental and neurological illnesses. But it serves my purpose because it enables me to look at those three domains and to ask what it is that the evidence has shown. Has the evidence shown incontrovertibly in these three domains that mental and neurological disorders are both brain disorders? How about the drugs? Let's begin with the drugs. Well, most of us know the story of the invention of psychopharmacology. The neuroleptics such as chlorpromazine, which was known as Largactil in Europe, Thorazine in the US, was invented in the 1950s. The first tranquilizers, Miltown, Librium and Valium, so-called mother's little helpers, were also invented in the 1950s. The antidepressants, imipramine, in the late 1950s, amitriptyline in the 1960s, and the SSRIs, Prozac and its sisters, in the 1980s. And over that period, an argument took hold that while the first generation of drugs had been found by chance, by looking at some of the unexpected side effects of drugs that had been developed to treat other conditions, what had happened since then was the development of drugs based on a real understanding of how they would work in the brain. And perhaps the clearest statement of that was a paper written by Joseph Schildkraut in 1965, where he articulated what has remained the basic hypothesis on which psychiatric drugs have been developed over the whole period since then. What has been designated the catecholamine or neurotransmitter hypothesis of affective disorders proposes that some or not all depressions are associated with an absolute or relative deficiency of these amines, particularly at functionally important adrenergic receptor sites in the brain. Elation may be associated with an excess of such amines. This hypothesis, he says, is undoubtedly at best a reductionist oversimplification of a very complex biochemical state. Nonetheless, this view that it was anomalies in the neurotransmitter system, too much or too little of one or other neurotransmitter at particular places in the brain, in particular in the synaptic cleft, underpinned drug development for the next 50 years. So this is a little quote from the Prozac website taken some time ago. Depression is not fully understood, but supports the view that people with depression have an imbalance of neurotransmitters, the chemicals that allow nerve cells in the brain to communicate with each other. And here is a helpful cartoon of what happens in normal brains, what happens in depressed brains, and how Prozac works. Now, you may think, oh, come on, Rose, you're not going to base your whole argument on an advertisement for Prozac, but here is an excerpt from Stephen Stahl's book, Essential Psychopharmacology, which shows very clearly this imagination, not just in the mind of those promoting the drugs, but also in the mind of those who gaze upon those with depression or those with other kinds of disorders and see or believe they can see deep inside their brain these anomalies within the synaptic cleft and the way in which the drugs bind to those receptor sites, affecting the level of neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. Well, that view, or at least the view that the drugs work, has certainly had a massive effect worldwide. And this is just an indication of the take-up of those antidepressants over the 10 years between 2000 and 2011 in all the countries which are explored by the health statistics of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And you can see that although there's been a lot of variation between countries, some countries have only had a small rise, some countries have had a huge rise. In every country, the uptake of these so-called antidepressant drugs, which have spread from being very smart drugs targeted at the neurobiological basis of depression to being used for OCD, for panic disorder, for anxieties, for any disorder that you can think of, has happened in every OECD country. There is Sweden, there is Norway, just a little bit above the OECD average. Now, at one point, people thought that these drugs were going to displace other psychiatric drugs. As the take-up of these drugs increased, the take-up of other psychiatric drugs would decrease. But this little diagram here, right, this is from the UK, but you would find exactly the same in almost every other country you looked at, would show you that the use of mood stabilizers, those dark purple ones, has stayed pretty much the same. The use of antipsychotics has stayed pretty much the same. The use of hypnotics and anxiolytics has stayed pretty much the same. But what's gone up and up and up is the use of antidepressants. They're not displacing other drugs. More and more of our fellow citizens across the world are taking these drugs. So does the take-up of these drugs demonstrate uncontrovertibly that psychiatric disorders are brain disorders? Well, we can be very quick about this, and I'm very happy to answer questions in the discussion. It is the case that anomalies in neurotransmission have never been demonstrated in the synapses of living patients diagnosed with mental disorders. Never demonstrated in the synapses of living patients with mental disorders. It's also the case that drugs developed to specifically target neurotransmitters are no more effective than those discovered by chance. It's also the case that for mild to moderate disorders, these drugs, antidepressant drugs, are no more effective than placebos. It's also the case that relapse after long-term maintenance on drugs, my colleague Robin Murray and his colleagues at King's College, and Robin and his colleagues are impeccably credentialed neuroscientists, argue convincingly that relapse on cessation after long-term maintenance, because we take these drugs for very long times, is actually an effect of drug withdrawal. It's not a relapse of the condition. There are almost no new drugs in the pipeline, and pharmaceutical companies are withdrawing from the development of these drugs because they can make more money elsewhere. Now, the drugs don't do nothing, but certainly they do not act on the pathways of the disorder. It may be that they damp down symptoms. It may be that they increase drowsiness. It may be that all these so-called side effects are actually the main effects by which they work. Now, don't take my word for this. Take the words of Steve Hyman, now director of the Broad Institute, former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and then after deciding that his time there was not all that successful, he went to become a provost of Harvard University. Now gone back to neuroscience. In a paper in 2012 called Revolution Stalled, he made exactly the same argument as I'm making here. Drug discovery is at a standstill, he said. Now, I don't expect you to read this, but this is the burden of what he says. The antidepressant drugs since the 1950s have not improved on the efficacy of those discovered in the 1950s. Many patients have modest benefits or not at all. Antipsychotic drugs, which did seem to work when they were first introduced, have gone down in their efficacy. We still don't know how mood stabilizers work. Even though they remain a mainstay of treatment. There are no useful treatments, pharmacological treatments for the core symptoms of autism. The molecular targets of all today's approved psychiatric drugs are the same as the targets of their pre-1960s prototypes, and their mechanisms of action are not understood beyond a few initial molecular events. Indeed, the critical molecular target or targets for lithium, which is used as the main mood stabilizer for bipolar disorder, have never been established with certainty. This controversial piece of research showing efficacy no greater than placebos in mild to moderate disorders was carried out by Irving Kirsch. And actually, I think that his work, because I've looked at it again, on this aspect is very, very convincing. That for mild to moderate disorders, the efficacy of placebo is no less than the efficacy of antidepressants, especially if placebos mimic some of the so-called side effects of antidepressants, like dry mouth, for instance. If the placebo mimics the side effects and people believe it's going to work, then of course it works. And that is because of a very simple thing that those of us who've consumed alcohol, or those of you who've consumed other illegal drugs know very well, that the effects of drugs depends as much on their symbolic significance as on their chemical action. If you drink 3 glasses of whiskey at a party, you'll probably feel very jolly. If I drink or drank 3 glasses of whiskey after the breakup of a relationship, I felt completely suicidal. Drug effects depend upon set and setting, on beliefs and expectations, and the same is true of all drugs. I think Nurofen in a smart, shiny package works much, much better to deal with my pain than generic ibuprofen. Of course it does, because it's in that shiny package. And actually that has also been demonstrated by controlled trials. Is pharma running out of brainy ideas? Well, it certainly is withdrawing from the development of central nervous system drugs. Here's Tom Insel again. The biggest problem isn't the announcements by GSK and AstraZeneca that they're stopping working in this area. It's when you look at the pipeline and see what companies are actually doing in psychiatric drug development. There are very few new molecular entities, very few novel ideas, and almost nothing that gives any hope for a transformation in treatment of mental illness. So this is the paradox. No one believes the neurotransmitter hypothesis is how the drugs work. The drugs today are no better than those discovered by chance 30 years ago. The drug companies are withdrawing. Millions of our fellow citizens worldwide are taking the drugs. Modulation of mood and cognition by drugs is routine. So maybe it's time for a radically new approach to recognize the failure of that psychopharmacological revolution, to recognize the drugs don't do nothing, but perhaps they just work for short-term symptom relief. And perhaps one should move away from thinking that better drugs will really, really target the basis of the disorder and try and recognize that most mental disorders arise not from neurochemical anomalies in the first place, but from social adversity. How about the genes? So we talked about this a little bit in some discussions earlier on today. Certainly there was a huge hope that genes for psychiatric disorders could be discovered. Here's Steve Hyman again, thinking that with neuroimaging and genetic studies, you could move psychiatric diagnoses out of just checklists of symptoms to objective medical tests. You could use genetic tests to reveal who was at high risk. You could use neuroimaging to see whether the disorder had set in. In 2003, 15 years ago, I don't want to sound too optimistic. The task is daunting, but the current pace of technological progress, or technological development, augurs well for progress. Well, of course, there's a long and dismal history of genetics of psychiatric disorders, long believed that psychiatric disorders run in families. Research on lineages seemed to support a single gene hypothesis, at least for schizophrenia and manic depression. And there were many claims based on these family studies and lineage studies to have discovered the genetic basis of these disorders, the gene 4, for instance, studies in the Old Amish on bipolar disorder, but none of them failed to replicate. That is to say, the first publications which seemed to demonstrate that could not be replicated by others who tried to do the same research in different populations. Of course, we know now that contemporary researchers don't do these lineage studies. They seek the specific sequences underlying the susceptibility for disorders. Now, we've seen a lot of claims to have discovered the specific sequences for schizophrenia, for instance, using family lineages, doing gene sequences of families which have a high incidence of these disorders and comparing those with controls that don't. For instance, a genetic sequence called disabled in schizophrenia 1 or another one called WKL1, all discovered in families that had a very high prevalence amongst many of their members of this condition. But when those same genes were looked for, same sequences were looked for in other families, they weren't found. So they seem to be specific to the families rather than general for the disorder. Of course, as anyone who looks at this area knows, the principal mode of investigation these days are so-called genome-wide association studies, which attempt to identify... Sorry, those slides have gone a bit weird in translating from Mac to to PC. They seek to identify panels of SNP variations, single nucleotide polymorphism variations, linked to increased susceptibilities for particular disorders. And these studies have been quite successful for some common complex disorders, not in psychiatry. Although not all agree. So in 2014, a big group, I know some people here are associated with this group, the Schizophrenia Working Group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, claimed that it had used GWAS studies, a very big GWAS study, to find the genomic, at least some of the genomics of schizophrenia. Here's what they say. On the basis of a multi-stage schizophrenia genome-wide association study of up to 36,989 cases and 103,000.75 controls, they'd identified 128 independent associations spanning 108 conservatively defined loci that meet genome-wide significance, 83 of which have not been previously reported. And they suggested that enriched associations were found among genes expressed in brain, providing biological plausibility for the findings. And this was a result which was much publicized, and indeed many people felt that this was the kind of work which would finally demonstrate that these disorders were disorders that had a genomic basis. It's just that that genomic basis was very, very complicated, involving many, many small variations in many, many genes that increased a person's likelihood of developing the disorder. So what have we discovered in these kinds of studies? That there are hundreds, maybe thousands, of small variations in the genetics of basic neuronal functioning which can lead to slight increases or decreases of the risk of developing the disorder. Many of those are in regions of the genome that haven't yet been identified as coding for proteins, so we have no idea what they do. Many of them are not specific to schizophrenia. Indeed, the researchers themselves say that these loci are shared in autism, in bipolar disorder, and in many, many disorders. None of these variations are necessary for those developing the disorder. Let's say many develop the disorder without having a particular variation. None of them are sufficient to develop the disorder, and there are many, many overlaps between cases and controls. And together they only account for a small proportion of the heritability. Much of the so-called heritability of this disorder is not accounted for. So are we on the right lines here, or are we not on the right lines? I've no doubt that there are many thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of variations at the very small level that affect differences between human individuals as they grow up in particular conditions. But are these the variations which we should seek to explore and exploit in understanding a condition like schizophrenia? Indeed, is there a condition like schizophrenia? Schizophrenia, of course, a very ancient diagnostic category. Big disputes as to whether it's one disorder or many, many disorders. My colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry, led by Robin Murray, argue that schizophrenia, or what we call schizophrenia, is in fact a diagnosis that's applied to a very heterogeneous group of people suffering severe psychotic disorders, and is probably just the extreme end of a dimension. And indeed, he suggests that the term schizophrenia will soon fade from our vocabulary like the term dropsy did in the 18th and 19th centuries. So Steve Hyman, whose work I like, says, this is of course 10 years ago, efforts to identify risk-conferring alleles have been largely unrewarding. The underlying genetics of neuropsychiatric disorders is highly complex. Similar symptoms can result from different combinations of risk factors. The same genetic variation may be associated with multiple diagnoses. What we think of as a single disease may in fact not be, and probably is not, a single disease, and that common diseases are more likely to represent families that share major physiological and symptomatic features, but can differ in crucial respects. So have we shown by our genetic studies that psychiatric disorders are brain disorders? I don't think we have. Surely the most compelling evidence would be if we could actually see these disorders in the brains of afflicted individuals. I should show you lots of pictures, but I don't have enough time to do so. So let me just make use of some meta-analyses of these structural and functional imaging studies. So as far as structural imaging studies are concerned, if you read Krishnan's classic chapter reviewing these in a recent handbook, he certainly says that since the advent of the ability to assess the brain in a living person, the Holy Grail has been the attempt to find the pathology in the disease, but it soon became apparent that there are few visually observable differences amongst patients with psychiatric disorders. And this is his argument. Visually observable volumetric changes, this is structural imaging, are rarely observable except in dementia. Some studies claim that grey matter loss in the hippocampus is characteristic of major depression, but a significant number of studies have failed to find evidence of that except in elderly patients. The findings are inconsistent. Some patients with schizophrenia do show these reductions, but these brain changes are found in patients with schizophrenia who've undergone a long period of drug treatment, and probably a long period of treatment in psychiatric hospital as well, which we know results in increased drug use, in increased cigarette smoking, in obesity, as well as all the social consequences of diagnosis. So it's very likely, in my view, that these changes are results of the diagnosis and its treatment rather than prior to and causal of the diagnosis of its treatment. And indeed, I know I'm quoting Robin Murray a lot in this paper, but that is indeed the conclusion that he and his group come to, and also pointing to the fact that many of the changes are reduced or disappear altogether when patients stop taking their antipsychotic medication. How about the functional changes? How about fMRI? Well, there are thousands of fMRI studies which compare psychiatric cases with healthy controls when people are asked to perform tasks in scanners. And indeed, they do find many brain areas which seem to differ between cases and controls. But unfortunately, these vary from study to study and from patient group to patient group. None differentiates between the different conditions. That is to say, none is consistently found in patients with depression or in patients with bipolar disorder or in patients with schizophrenia. And in fact, all the differences that are reliably found seem to relate to brain areas associated with anxiety and arousal. Well, if I was a lawyer, I would say something like, I put it to you, members of the jury, that the conditions under which someone diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder undergoes a brain scan are quite different from the conditions under which someone who is not diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder undergoes a brain scan. Leaving aside the effects of the medication, leaving aside the effects of hospitalization, the anxiety and arousal which a patient will have when they're put in the scanner is quite different from the anxiety and arousal that the patient will have, that the non-patient will have if they are put in a scanner. And indeed, there's been some very interesting ethnographic work by my former colleague Simon Cohn at Goldsmiths College showing exactly that. So have structural and functional imaging clearly demonstrated that mental and neurological disorders are disorders of the brain? I'm afraid not. There is a different way. So a few years after he came to the end of his tenure as director of the National Institute of Mental Health, Tom Insel initially left NIMH to go to Google Life Sciences, And then when he left Google Life Sciences, he set up as one does, of course, no doubt, in the United States, he set up a startup of his own called MindStrong. And when he was interviewed at the beginning of MindStrong, he said this: I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realize that while I think I succeeded in getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that. Is that an apology? So if that is the case, if we have spent $20 billion in the United States alone, hundreds and thousands of studies, hundreds and thousands of person hours trying to find this, what should we do? Is it the case, as Steve Hyman, who I respect a great deal, says, give us more time, give us more money, give us better instruments, give us optogenetics, and we will get there in the end? Or is it time for a radical rethink? I'm a great friend of neuroscience. You may not think so on the basis of this talk today, but we have learned much more about the brain in the last 30 years than we've ever learned before. But to use the old cliche, the more we know we don't know. The more we know, the more we have found it almost impossible to scale up from molecules to minds. A long time ago, when I started this work, I chaired a lecture by the Nobel laureate for physiology or medicine, Eric Kandel, at the London School of Economics. He opened that lecture by an anecdote. He remembered when he was 3 or 4 years old, he was sitting on the floor of his parents' flat in Vienna at the time of the Anschluss. And the stormtroopers broke into his parents' flat. And he has a very clear memory of the fact that he was sitting on the floor playing with a little blue train. Now, those of you who know Kandel's work will know that, long story short, he spent many, many years thinking that the way to do neuroscience was to find the simplest possible organism that had something like a memory, in this case the gill withdrawal reflex of the Californian sea slug, and he studied that for 20 years. And by the end of that period, he believed he knew how the gill withdrawal reflex of the Californian sea slug habituated if you kept poking it. It had some kind of molecular memory. So I asked Professor Kandel at the end of his lecture, are you any closer to understanding how you have the memory of that little blue train that you were playing with on the floor of your parents' house in Vienna? And the answer was clearly no. So the reductionist paradigm has revealed those molecular mechanisms at the cost of a failure to understand something which is really quite fundamental in biology, which is cells are in organs, and organs are in organisms, and organisms are in milieu, and the properties of organisms are the things on which evolution has worked. You need to put the brain back into the organism back in its milieu, and place the lot in the temporality of evolution and the temporality of development. When I was a baby biologist back sometime in the middle of last century in John Maynard Smith's lab, our mantra was nothing in biology makes sense except in the timescale of evolution and the timescale of development. This is one of my favorite microbiologists, sadly died recently, Carl Woese, Rose, the discoverer of the arcana, as you can see there, the phylogenetic tree of life. One piece of my research I rather grandiosely titled A New Sociology for a New Century. It was modelled on this paper by Rose, A New Biology for a New Century. In the last decades, we've seen the molecular reductionist reformulation of biology grind to a halt, a vision of the future spent, leaving us with only a gigantic, whirring biotechnology machine. And he argues that biology is at a point where it needs to make a choice. It needs to make a choice between continuing on its track, current track, or reintegrating itself and pressing forward as a fundamental science with a focus on holistic, non-linear, and emergent biology. And you see in the second half of this quote that I won't have a chance to read out. He argues too about the heavy price that was paid by separating the organism from its environment, from its history, and from the evolutionary flow, shredding it into parts, shredding the cell into parts as well, and that our task now is to resynthesize. I think there is a way, and in the book, probably I don't have much time to argue this. In the book, I argue that there is a different way of relating organism and neurobiology in relation to mental distress. And that is to turn the problem on its head. To turn the problem on its head and to focus on what Adolf Meyer, that forgotten person in American psychiatry, talked of as formulation. If the physician wishes to understand the mental patient, he must not treat him as an experimental animal in a physiological laboratory, but must do justice to the fullness of human nature and the complexity of the social environment. His students start with the patient's complaint and try to produce the fullest possible analysis of how that complaint has come to be. Looking at biology, yes, but looking at biology as it's shaped by the way in which that individual has experienced their life over the whole of its history from conception to the present. This keeps the therapeutic problem of the patient in our focus, the assets as well as the difficulties, the course and the probabilities of outcome. These are the best ways for someone like Meyer of making that analysis and of developing your intervention. And of course, there are others in the area of neuroscience who've also argued that. Kurt Goldstein, in his wonderful book, The Organism, a neurologist, spent a lot of time working on brain injuries of people in wartime, argued very strongly that you had to think of diseases as conditions of the whole living organism in multiple relations with their environment. Only such methods will carry us forward which consider the single phenomenon in its significance for the whole organism. Now, I argue that there are movements within the life sciences that provide us with the possibility of thinking the relationship between organism, neurobiology and its environment in precisely the reverse direction, thinking not of genetics but of epigenetics, of the way in which the activation of the genome, especially in the brain, is shaped by its experience in its milieu. Neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, the microbiome, all these things which place the organism back in its environment and see the way in which multiple insults from the environment may shape the biology of the human and the neurobiology of the human from the moment of conception, if not before. I could say much more about that, but I won't. My conclusion is that another psychiatry is possible, one which is no less scientific, one which is no less recognizing of the biological nature of the human being, one which is no less respectful of neurobiology, but which recognizes that nothing in biology makes sense except in the time of evolution and the time of development. And we are beginning to understand, not just for common mental disorders, but also for serious mental disorders, the psychosis, just how much those are shaped and stimulated or can be buffered against by social relations, by interactions, by beliefs, by all those relationships that surround individuals. This may sound like woolly hand waving, and indeed many people think it is, but I think, and I'm not the only person who thinks that this is the path and the way forward for psychiatry. The path for neuroscience to become a genuinely human science. It is hugely challenging if you begin to try and map out those pathways. And as you'll see, this is the diagram from the classic paper on stress of McEwen and Stellar in 1993. This is just one attempt to begin to understand some of those interdependencies which shape molecular systems, which don't seek to translate that way, but seek to translate that way. And indeed, it's not a wholly novel thought. So let me just conclude with a quote from Claude Bernard's Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine in 1865. Physiologists and physicians must never forget that a living being is an organism with its own individuality. We really must learn that if we break up a living organism by isolating its different parts, it's only for the sake of ease in experimental analysis, and by no means in order to conceive them separately. Indeed, when we wish to ascribe to a physiological quality its value and true significance, we must always refer it to this whole and draw our final conclusions only in relation to its effects in the whole. And those are two little heroes of mine, Kurt Goldstein and Georges Canguilhem, who help us think this way, help us move towards a new conception of the biological, a new ontology of the vital organism. And with apologies for exceeding my time, I'll stop. Thank you.